Notebook on Cities and Culture's Korea Tour is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, David Hayes, and Polar Inertia Journal, an outlet for artists and researchers documenting the urban condition at polarinertia.com. Living in Los Angeles, I think a lot about the depictions of Los Angeles in cinema, or the roles Los Angeles plays in cinema. What movies do you think of when you think of really interesting depictions of Seoul?
Yeah, it's an issue I've been thinking about recently myself as well. And actually this year the Toronto Film Festival will have a special section devoted to Seoul as a cinematic city.
Oh, wow.
And so...
When's the film festival?
That's coming in September, and so...
I'm going to be in Toronto in September. I got to go to this.
So they'll have a mixture of new and older films, I think. And actually, I think I'll be writing something about this similar theme, not for the festival itself, but in another publication. But, I mean, to be honest, one of the films that really stands out to me is The Host by Bong Joon-ho. And it's a monster movie that really kind of captures the... something about the look of the city. The challenge with Seoul is that it's, different neighborhoods kind of clash with each other in terms of mood and visuals. You have the north side of the city, which has a much longer history compared to the areas that are south of the river, most of which have been built, since 1980.
Right.
And every neighborhood has its own personality, and so it's really hard for a single film to capture the essence of Seoul. Although it's interesting when filmmakers attempt to do that.
Who attempts with the most sort of effort?
Well, I think that, this is a slightly different example, but recently Park Chan-wook and his brother Park Chan-kyung made a documentary, and it was similar in some ways to the concept behind Life in a Day, which solicited footage from all around the world, and then they edited it together to show, one day in the life of the planet. Actually, I didn't like that film, but the Park brothers made a film called Bitter, Sweet, Soul. Bittersweet Soul.
Yes. It's made the rounds on the internet.
Yes, you can see it on YouTube. It's an hour long, and I found it really quite fascinating, and I thought it was really well structured and edited together. The images flow very smoothly together, and many of the shots that are in the film were taken by foreigners who were visiting the city, sometimes just for the first time, and so a big part of the film was made by people who are not intimately familiar with the city.
Right. They were just looking for stuff they thought was neat.
Yeah, and so it's actually, Park Chan-kyung said that in one sense that was a little disappointing because they got too much footage of the most famous sites.
Yeah.
But given the tremendous amount of footage they had, they were able to whittle everything down into a really interesting hour-long segment. But there are other examples like, recently there was a movie that came out called Cold Eyes, which is a remake of the Hong Kong film Eye in the Sky. Both films are set in the city. It involves a character who plots these crimes and who really directs them in a way from the top of a tall building, and so watches when the police car arrives from the right, and looks down to see what his henchmen are doing.
It's a very Hong Kong type premise.
It is, and it works really well. The concept works really well in the original film. Hong Kong's a very vertical city, very compressed, and in remaking it, one of the challenges for the filmmakers was relocating it to Seoul, which is a much broader type of space. And I think they were remarkably successful in doing that. It's one of the few remakes that I think is equally interesting when you compare it to the original in a number of different respects. But one of the things they tackled successfully was to give it a particular visual look and a feel that really is representing kind of Seoul as a city.
And it's here in Seoul, the real city, that I'm sitting with a man whose name you know if you're a Westerner and have ever been interested in Korean cinema. It's Darcy Paquet. You might have encountered him as a critic, as the founder of KoreanFilm.org, perhaps more recently as the founder of the Wildflower Film Awards, which focuses on low-budget independent Korean movies. You may know him in many different ways. You may have seen him in a movie or on a TV drama. You may have heard the interview we recorded 3-4 years ago about his book, New Korean Cinema, Breaking the Waves. You may know him from that book. There are many possibilities, but Darcy, did you know Korean cinema well first, or Seoul well first?
I guess I got to know Seoul well before I knew Korean cinema well.
In what era? I don't want to do too much of a cover of our old interview, but when did you first get here?
I came to Seoul for the first time in 1997. I've been living here ever since. And so in some ways, my discovery of the city and the culture has gone in step with learning the cinema.
Did any of that precede? I remember you saying you had friends in America who were Korean who wanted you to watch Korean cinema, which in that era, it's a little bit unusual, right? Typically, they would say back then, no, don't watch those. Just keep watching Hollywood movies.
Yeah, and my friends in the US showed me a couple films. I only saw 2 films before actually coming to Korea. And both films were set in the past, and so, to be honest, before my plane landed in Korea, I had very little visual reference for what I was coming into. And I think the situation is different today for a lot of the foreigners who come into Korea to spend some time, either to study or to live, because you can experience the city through the movies.
Right. They've seen The Host. They've seen that monster going through the river. They know kind of what to expect.
Yeah. And again, there's great diversity in the films, but I think that through the films you can get a sense of kind of the energy of the city and the dynamism of it.
Now, how much of a sense, did you have a greater sense that Seoul would grow so much in the intervening decades, or that Korean cinema would grow so much? Which would have seemed like the more likely thing to blow up? They both have, but which one, when you got here, or when you just started getting a life here, would you have been like, yeah, the city is going to get big, or yeah, cinema's going to get big?
You could tell from the beginning that the city was going to change quite dramatically in the coming years, because just living here, you see the changes taking place so quickly.
Everything was probably construction when you were here at first.
Yeah, and in the first few years, I'd travel back to my hometown in Massachusetts about once a year, and in the intervening year, nothing had changed. But after 2 weeks in Massachusetts, I'd come back to Korea and find all these changes.
Still nothing has changed in Massachusetts, right?
Right, it's still pretty much the same. But Seoul has certainly grown a lot, and those who've been away for a long time come back to the city, find the changes really quite startling. And even living here and seeing them taking place gradually, you can't help but notice it. Whereas the film industry, nobody really expected growth on this level. Looking back in hindsight, you can kind of point to some reasons why it may have happened. Korean society was changing very quickly, and Korean cinema really had its first opportunity to operate on kind of a normal scale, normal level in the 1990s, and so the growth, I think, was a result of that.
Right. Now, because it had its first opportunity then, it seems like, you tell me that scenario, like a country that doesn't really have its opportunity to come into its own until the 90s, you think, well, then where did all the filmmaking talent come from, right? Like, why was anybody ready to make movies at that time, and why were they?
One thing I felt very distinctly when I first came to Korea was kind of the general and very strong interest in cinema among, particularly young Koreans. Just a couple of weeks after I arrived in Korea, I went down to the second Busan Film Festival. The atmosphere there is just really quite remarkable. That was a different era. The film festival was a very different sort of beast at that time, but certainly you could feel that there was a great deal of enthusiasm and curiosity and interest in film. Korea at that time had numerous weekly film magazines that were doing quite well. And even though there wasn't great interest in what local filmmakers were producing at that time, there was a very strong interest in the films that were coming out of Europe and Iran and all parts of the world.
So they were into world cinema already.
Yeah, they were. And you could feel that if Korean filmmakers started to produce something that impressed the local audience, that they would support local filmmakers.
I see. Now, this idea that Koreans usually they steered foreigners away from their movies. I mean, it's ironic. I think some of those very movies they would have told me not to see are the ones I've been most interested in since the sort of 옛날 영화, the ones before the boom, the ones before even the 90s, the ones before the 80s. I mean, it's why do you think Koreans were so seemingly ashamed of those before the big current cinema boom?
I mean, I think that it may just be a question of perspective, because I mean, from our perspective now, we can look back and kind of cherry pick the most interesting titles from the past. And the 70s, for example, are a decade that I'm really fascinated by, and there are a number of films from that decade that I really love. And a couple of years ago, I helped put together a retrospective on 1970s Korean cinema. On the other hand, if you pick a film at random out of the 70s, you're likely to get a very bad film.
Yes.
And I think that the experience of ordinary Koreans is more likely to, caught films here and there on TV. And
they haven't looked back selectively.
Right. And, there have been successful films in the past, but more generally, I mean, if you were interested in, politics or social change, then Korean cinema really struggled for many years to say something relevant about society because of censorship and all these other issues. If you were interested in kind of, global filmmaking and, if you followed what was coming out at the Cannes Film Festival every year, Korean films were absent from such events. And so, I think it was inevitable that people, they didn't really value the films that had come out at that point. There was a sense that, there was no really strong tradition to follow. On the other hand, now, after several years of success, many people are looking back at filmmakers like Kim Gi-young and Lee Man-hee and realizing that there is a lot to learn from the filmmakers of the past.
When you're picking out your favorite films from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s from Korea, what do you find your selections do that modern Korean films don't? What strengths do they have that maybe current ones don't?
I mean, for me, one of the biggest differences is kind of the attitude behind, the whole project of filmmaking. And I think that in the 70s, for example, filmmakers were working under a very oppressive and restrictive environment. But sort of, if you were an ambitious filmmaker and you wanted to make interesting films that had interesting things to say, then kind of your fundamental starting point was that you had to resist the system. You had to find some way to either indirectly or through stealth.
You're bending the rules, which is a time-honored Korean tradition.
Yeah, and so you started off with this spirit of rebellion, in a sense. And often the system proved to be stronger than these films themselves, and they would not escape the censorship process undamaged. The filmmakers did not have the opportunities that today's filmmakers had. And so in many senses, the quality of the films is not up to the level of today's films. On the other hand, I think most Korean filmmakers today approach filmmaking with the attitude that I'd like to carve out this comfortable space for myself inside the system. And so it is quite different. People are looking to filmmakers of the past, and they're not really looking to overturn the system. They're not. I guess there's less of a rebellious spirit to contemporary films.
Trying to find a way to accommodate it or to have it accommodate them.
Right, and it seems almost, too arrogant to go up against this successful tradition. But I do think that contemporary filmmakers could learn a lot from directors like Ha Gil-jong, for example, who were making interesting films in the 70s and really struggling at the same time he was doing it.
Of any era, Korean films of any era, are they an effective way to sort of immerse yourself in the culture in the sense that you can then live better in the culture? Like, you've been living here since 97. how effective a tool would you say watching Korean films is to do something like that, to ready yourself for life here?
I mean, I think it depends on how you look at it, because you don't want to get too confused between the reality that's presented in the films and the reality that exists outside the window.
But there is sort of a desire for social realism with Korean audiences in their films, right? To see themselves actually reflected.
Yeah, I think there is. The attitude that I take is that even if the reality that we see inside the film may not correspond with what's outside, the films very accurately represent like the ideas of the filmmakers and the attitudes of the filmmakers, and that's very real. And so,
read between the lines a bit, sure.
Yeah, don't get too focused on the details, but I think there is a lot you can learn through cinema. There's a lot you can learn about Korean society, even if you only experience Korean society through its cinema. And obviously, if you're living here, then it's a great compliment to your daily life and your experience of living in a different culture.
It does enrich it. I was talking to a foreigner, an American, who's lived here for 13 years, I think, and he was saying he doesn't like the films of Hong Sang-soo, one of my favorite directors, but he doesn't like them for a reason I can understand, because he says, I read novels and I watch films to look for the experience of an exceptional person. And in Hong Sang-soo's movies, a bunch of middle-aged guys getting drunk, it being watched by other middle-aged guys just sort of nodding like, yes, that's how it is. He doesn't want to see the mirror. Do you think it is, I used this metaphor before, but do you think it is accurate to say that the Koreans, maybe the audiences do have more of a desire for the mirror than most?
I'm not sure. I think that, Hong Sang-soo is a director that many Koreans also feel some frustration with.
Ironically, he's more popular not in Korea, yeah.
To a certain extent, although he does have his fan base in Korea. And I'm certainly consider myself among his fans.
Yes.
And I look forward to his films, even if on the surface they look very similar and you can more or less expect where the films are going to go in one sense. But yeah, I think, his approach to cinema, it's very personal, and very abstract in a way. Like he said before that he doesn't make films about reality. He makes films about kind of structures and patterns that he comes up with it in his head.
Yes. And yet, they're treated as so realistic.
That's right. And the realism is on the surface, but there's a lot beneath the surface if you look into it. I don't know. I think every viewer comes to cinema with different expectations, and they're looking for different things in films, but I guess my project is to encourage people to diversify a bit and to expect different things from different films, or just be open to whatever the films give you.
Right. For those who don't know, who have only seen Korean blockbusters, how big is the rest of the iceberg, sort of below that tip of the highest profile, the Oldboys, the Shiris, I'm trying to think of a newer example than Oldboy and Shiri. Is Snowpiercer a blockbuster? Anyway, yeah. How big is the iceberg?
There are two levels to this, because within commercial cinema itself, there are films that work well with overseas audience that distributors in other countries are interested in buying. And then there are films that work very well in Korea and may also work very well in other parts of Asia, but which don't really work with Western audiences. And when I say that, I don't mean that if you sit Western audiences down in front of the screen and show them the film that they don't like it, because often they really do like it, but they're just really hard to market, and so it doesn't kind of fit into the distribution system.
They'll like it, you just have to get them in front of it first.
Yeah, which is a challenge.
Yes.
And so there is, the blockbusters and the successful films are really probably only half of what you see in commercial cinema. But the other thing is that there are huge numbers of independent films being made, and there's great diversity within those independent films as well. If you just look at movies that actually receive a theatrical release, even if it is sometimes a small theatrical release, you get probably 70 or 80 films per year that are coming out and overlooked by audiences, but if you seek them out, they're really quite interesting.
Where do you have to find them? Where do you have to go to find them?
There are a few specialty theaters in Seoul, and so there's Indie Space and Indie Plus and Cinecube, and so frequent these theaters, then you can find a much broader selection of cinema, or a different kind of cinema that you'd find in the multiplexes. And also, like the biggest multiplex chain, CGV, for example, has a subdivision called Movie Collage, where they'll devote certain screens in certain theaters to either Korean independent films or imported films from Europe, kind of non-specialty cinema.
It seems like a contrast to how it is in the States. You don't really see those worlds mixing, the worlds of the mega chains and of... We think of the mega chains and the sort of single-screen indie theaters as being completely different spheres. Maybe we're seeing a little more mixture now, but it seems like that the wall was never quite so thick in Korea. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, there was a sense that that everybody's in it together, and I think probably the reason that these big companies, invest in independent films and devote some of their screens to independent cinema is out of a sense of moral duty or pressure from other members of the film industry. So it's more for PR, perhaps, that they do this, and for their image. On the other hand, there are occasionally success stories with independent films, and so within the sphere of independent films, they've kind of focused on a certain type of independent film that may be more likely to break out. I don't think they lose a ton of money on those divisions.
The risk is small.
Yeah, it is a smaller risk, and there is some potential for success.
Now, I mentioned on the opposite side of the spectrum from the indie movies, the low-budget ones, the Snowpiercers, the recent movies that are made by Korean filmmakers, but in the West, in English usually, movies that a Westerner could see and not even know that it's a Korean director. And there have been a few of them, mostly since we last spoke, in fact. And I remember, I haven't seen the film The Last Stand, the Arnold Schwarzenegger one with I guess the premise is a car goes really fast. That's maybe the entire premise.
That's the most important aspect of the film, yeah.
But I couldn't believe it. I was not... Who was the director? Who was the Korean director of that film?
Kim Ji-yoon.
Okay, yes. And what were his Korean movies?
I mean, my favorite of his is A Bittersweet Life.
I saw a screening of that. Yeah. He came out after it. This was during production of The Last Stand. And this was in Los Angeles, obviously. And he was describing, people were asking him what's it like working in America on a Schwarzenegger movie. And he was speaking through a translator, and his posture and everything. It was just like he was going to lay down and die right there. It sounds like he didn't have a good experience, and it seems like occasionally Korean filmmakers don't with the big movies, the big Western movies, that seem like they might be a dream to make, but maybe they're more of a nightmare sometimes.
Well, it's funny. I mean, certainly it was a difficult and challenging experience, both for Kim Ji-yoon and for Park Chan-wook, who shot Stoker. In Park Chan-wook's case, he had much more kind of creative input and control over the course of the film. Kim Ji-yoon's an interesting example because, I mean, he is a self-taught filmmaker. He never went to film school. And in a way, I think he may have approached this project as a way of giving himself a new experience and learning a new filmmaking system. And
got that.
Yeah.
Do you think he approached it wanting to make a Schwarzenegger movie about a fast car?
Well, it's fine.
Is the movie any good? I haven't seen it, but I just assume it's awful.
I mean, the script is awful. Okay. Some of the acting is awful.
Sure.
Although it does have this kind of punchy energy in parts that...
Right.
There's one early scene that feels to me very Kim Ji-yoon.
Oh, yeah?
And it's the very first scene of the film. After that, you don't find too much in the film that carries his stamp.
Does anything feel Korean in these movies? In a Stoker, in a Snowpiercer, in a Last Stand? Do you get a sense of Koreanness at all, or just of the individual personalities of the filmmakers who happen to be Korean?
I think there's both. I mean, Last Stand is the one where I think it feels the most like a Hollywood film because, I mean, in a sense, he was a director for hire, that he came in and he directed the project. Kim Ji-yoon, he has a very kind of cool demeanor, and although he did say on separate occasions that he did learn a lot from the experience, and he is planning to shoot another film in Hollywood.
Oh, really?
But this time around, it sounds much more like something up his alley that he'll be able to put his personal stamp on. In the case of Park Chan-wook, I mean, certainly it feels very much like a Park Chan-wook film. Visually, he took his own cinematographer there, and so I think it is a mix because it wasn't his own screenplay. When I watch the film, I feel this weird dissonance between things in the film that are recognizably Park Chan-wook and things that feel to me kind of awkwardly, I don't know, that just don't seem to fit in some ways with what he was doing with the film. Other people disagree. I mean, the film has some strong supporters, but it was a bit of a disappointment for me. I mean, Snowpiercer is the most interesting example because it's not like the other two examples, a Hollywood film. It is, in fact, a Korean film that was produced and financed by a Korean company. Park Chan-wook, in fact, was the producer, one of the producers of the film. And the director had more or less complete control over the production. It's just that he was making a film that was in English with an international cast. It was shot in the Czech Republic. And really, it's quite rare for a smaller industry like Korea to produce a film on that scale with an international cast that's really targeted at international audiences. And so he was trying to make a Hollywood-style production, but to do it in-house
I see.
with his own methods.
Is there an assumption that a movie with a Korean setting is just not going to play internationally in the way they want, in the way they want these Western shot movies to?
Well, it is more of a challenge if it's set in Korea. It feels awkward if you shoot a film in Korea in English.
That's true. I mean, would it have to be entirely in English? So we're entering an age where I think it's a little more acceptable to have a bunch of different languages in a movie, or to even be in a bunch of different locations. You don't have to sort of imitate Western movies you've seen before anymore, right?
Yeah, I really hope so. I mean, I'm someone who's always been a little puzzled by the received wisdom that Americans don't read subtitles and that it's too uncomfortable for them. And, you know, just it seems strange with people consuming text all day long on their phones and on their computers that they'd have some issue with reading text at the bottom of a movie screen.
Maybe you can sit in row one and you have to like turn your actual head, but still.
Right, and it seems to be more kind of an image problem. And, you know, if we can kind of break the negative image that people have of subtitled films, then perhaps there's more potential for directors like Bong Joon-ho to make films in Korean that could maybe reach a much wider audience.
You know, you mentioned CGV theaters. We have one, maybe more than one in Los Angeles, but one right near the subway station I use in Los Angeles, in Koreatown where I live. And I go there with my girlfriend. We usually just go to only the subtitle-free movies, the 자막 없는 영화. I ask for those because she's a native speaker, and I only really learn the language if I don't have the subtitles to read. But have you found movies, have they been an essential aid to you mastering the language, or is it all talking and living life? Or can you draw a meaningful amount of language knowledge from movies?
I think movies do help a lot. And I mean, there are different ways of studying through movies. I mean, for me, it was not only the movies themselves, but I mean, for example, buying film magazines each week, and a lot of my vocabulary expanded through the words that happen to appear in film titles, because I'd have to learn the titles of all these new films that were coming out.
What are some words you wouldn't expect to have learned quickly in that way?
Oh gosh, there's, I mean, some slang, almost anything really, because when you're first starting out, you know, your textbooks kind of teach you the vocabulary that they expect foreigners will need in Korea. But actually, if you're living in Korea, you need all the vocabulary, you know,
Yes.
and all the different registers, the formal and the informal.
Right.
And so, I mean, film is really good for giving you the informal language that you don't find in textbooks. And perhaps you need some help in digesting it or understanding it. But yeah, film is a good way for that kind of exposure, especially if you don't have a lot of Korean friends.
Right. I mean, is there a method to this? Can you just watch a lot of movies and listen really hard, or would you do something different?
I think it helps if you kind of mix it up a bit. And so, I mean, sometimes watching DVDs, for example, with Korean subtitles helps you.
That's very important.
Yeah, helps you to understand more of what you're hearing. Even if you don't know the actual vocabulary, you can kind of, on an auditory level, to interpret the speech. It's helped sometimes to see a movie and then to talk about it with a friend, to ask about things you didn't understand, and if you can have a simple conversation about the film in Korean, then, I mean, often just language exposure, in a general sense, it's better when it's not random, and if it's focused on a particular subject, and especially a subject that you feel passionate about, because then you're much more motivated to learn the details. And So yeah, I think for film fans, then learning Korean through films is particularly effective.
Definitely. Well, when did you start understanding the jokes in movies?
The jokes come last, which is really frustrating because you're watching a comedy and you're understanding everything that they're saying except the punchlines, and everybody's laughing.
They laugh at the inverted moments from when you laugh.
That's right, and you're just thinking, what was that last thing that I missed? The funny thing.
Yeah. What was that last syllable all the humor was on that I didn't manage to catch? Right. It's a way to get... how effective a way are films to get an idea of the diversity of Korea? It sort of sounds ridiculous to say the diversity of South Korea to a foreigner for whom it seems all the same at first. But is it a way to realize, how diverse the language is, how diverse the behavior is across the country? Or have films always been kind of soul-centric?
I think it is important, and to a certain extent you have to be adventurous in your choice of films. And if you watch only very mainstream films, then most of those films present a fairly uniform image of what Korea is like.
Which is what?
I don't know. It's perhaps slightly more upscale than it is in real life, or it focuses on the upscale portions of society. There's kind of an interesting fetishization of some aspects of traditional Korea, whereas in real life, the traditional houses are being torn down. But in the films, they are much more, placed with much more importance.
But now those hanok are expensive, so maybe they'll be in those sort of upper class type movies now that they cost 10 times as much as they used to.
Yeah, hanok is a really interesting example. These traditional Korean houses, because they're in real life a bit uncomfortable to live in. They're cold in the winter. They have these outdoor spaces that you have to move through to get to the bathroom. But on the other hand, kind of modernized hanok is becoming quite trendy. Different neighborhoods are, becoming this kind of locus of hanok restoration. And so it's not a real case of preserving history so much as aesthetics. And the films give you an idea of aesthetic attitudes. But of course, real life is a clash between aesthetics and convenience and everything else.
What are some of the things? You mentioned the maybe disproportionate affluence of the characters in Korean movies, but of the Korean movies that get popular, or even the TV dramas, which are very popular in some parts of America and the rest of the world, what else is inaccurate about their portrayal of Korean life? What do people draw from these movies and shows and think, that's how it is in Korea, huh? That isn't really how it is.
Yeah, I think that it stems less from kind of a desire to hide or to distort certain aspects of Korean experience as it is just kind of the mechanics of filmmaking. There's a desire to present films in a way that moves the viewer emotionally. And I think in Korean cinema, these moments where the emotion kind of washes over you are particularly important, more so than in Hollywood films. Hollywood films are much more kind of focused on classical storytelling, I think, whereas Korean films, these moments of impact and of emotional having the emotion wash over you.
Someone might ask, why is the last 20 minutes of every Korean movie just crying if they've seen certain movies?
Yeah, and it's related to the melodrama in Korean films. It's related to the violence in Korean films sometimes, these moments of shock. But because of that, I think that because you're structuring the film in a way to produce a certain emotional response, that I think inevitably you kind of simplify aspects of real life, or maybe you exaggerate or de-emphasize other aspects.
It seems that doesn't always work on foreign viewers. Would you say that's true? There's a big gap between the effectiveness of that on Koreans and on everybody else.
Yeah, that's true, except that when we say foreign viewers, there's also a very different kind of audience in Asia than there is in the US or in Europe. Even differences between the European audience and the American audience. And so different films work better in different parts of the world. There are very few filmmakers who can successfully target all these markets at once.
Who's the best at being universal in that way?
I would say that I mean, Bong Joon-ho is one that does seem to work particularly well in many different markets. I've been surprised at the extent of Kim Ki-duk's universality. I mean, he's a director who makes a lot of Korean viewers feel uncomfortable because
he's not that beloved here, is he?
It's an interesting case because he's very famous in Korea. I think people, particularly in recent years, they've come to respect the work that he does. And Pieta,
it shows a side of urban Korea we never really see in other movies.
Right. That film did connect with audiences in a way that his previous films did not. And I think it was more than just the fact that this film won the top prize at Venice and became the first Korean film to win the top prize at a major festival. But I think there was something in the filmmaking itself that emotionally there was this connection with local audiences that hadn't existed before.
And what are we seeing in Korea that we haven't seen before in that movie? I feel like it feels true to me that that's something, it's a setting we just have never seen before. But is that necessarily true?
Yeah, to me, I mean, that setting, this area, the Cheonggyecheon
back alley machine shops, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, this is an area that's disappearing these days. That area is being redeveloped. And so it may be more reflective of the director's memory. And it is aestheticized, I think. When you look at it, it doesn't
pretty grim.
really look the way. I mean, it's a very grim image, but it's also a stylized image in a way. I mean, Kim Ki-duk's films are all visually quite inventive and stylized in different ways. And so he shows a more gritty side to Korea. On the other hand, I don't know, it's not necessarily a very realistic portrayal either.
Gritty is not always realistic. That's an important point to underscore.
Yeah, and I think that every director has their own aesthetic, but really there have been very few directors who really set out with a realist objective. That's different from the case in the 80s and the 90s where you felt that really was a strong objective.
I remember a lot of 1980s working class oriented movies from Korea. Were there really that many, or have I just seen somehow very many?
There was a particular movement at that time. It didn't really represent the mainstream of the film industry. And most of these films were not particularly popular with audiences, but they're well remembered now.
I think of like a Chilsu and Mansu.
Yeah.
Like the comedy. Does that movie hold any importance in Korean cinema? I feel like I talk about it quite a lot with people, but...
No, it is really important, and it's important as a starting point because this is the first film that really did kind of step in after the relaxation of censorship and make a political point. And it's a somewhat indirectly stated political point. I think Westerners watching the film will not be kind of shocked by its radicalism or anything like that, but within the context of its time, it was a film that really stood out. And the last half hour, especially, works really well. I show that to my students. I teach a Korean cinema class.
Specifically the last half hour or the whole movie?
The last half hour. And I feel bad in showing them the ending without the whole film, but as a standalone segment, it works really, really well. And it captures some of the ironies of that time in the sense that you have these working class characters who are standing at the top of the building and they decide to just start shouting out their frustrations. And they're really shouting at the upper class citizens of Seoul and, screaming about what they're dissatisfied with. And on the street below, where nobody can hear what they're saying, people misinterpret their actions, and the police think it's some kind of a labor demonstration, and they're drinking
not something you wanted to be seen doing in the 1980s in Korea.
Right, they're drinking soju, and people think that they're holding Molotov cocktails. But it's really kind of an accurate, an appropriate symbol for what was going on at the time, because the working class tries to express themselves, but there's such a huge gap between them and the rest of society that misunderstandings are inevitable and conflict results from that.
Are we still in any sense in Chilsu and Mansu's Korea?
Oh, it's changed. I don't know. I mean, certain aspects of Korea have changed quite a bit, but certainly other aspects have not. Yeah, I think that in many ways the film industry has abandoned this type of filmmaking. But outside the reality of Korea, there's still a lot in today's Korea that resonates quite strongly with what you see in that film.
It makes me think of all the Korean movies I've seen with strong social political criticisms built in, and there's more than I would expect. I mean, even in a movie where you know it's going to be overt, there's more than you'd think. What was 그때 그 사람들 called in English?
Yeah, this was The President's Last Bang.
I can never remember that title because it's so dumb. Anyway, yes, this movie, The President's Last Bang, about the assassination of Park Chung-hee. It's you know what it's going to be about going in, but it's still not what you expect, right? It's still somehow, I don't know, what is the form of criticism being played out in that movie?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that film. It's a film that divides people and which infuriated the real life children of Park Chung-hee.
As in the president?
As in the current president, yes.
Yeah.
She didn't actually come out and publicly criticize it because she was a leading politician at the time. But her brother, Park Chung-hee's son, was much more outspoken and, issued a lawsuit against the film trying to block it and successfully, they issued this ruling that basically obligated the filmmakers to take out certain documentary segments of the film, arguing that viewers would be confused about the extent to which this film was fact or fiction.
Right. To what extent is it fact or fiction? Because it seems to adhere to a framework of true events. I mean, his own security chief did shoot him ultimately, and how much is how freewheeling is it beyond that?
I think that when he was making this film, director In Sang-soo knew that he was going to be the target of criticism, obviously. And so because of that, he did set out to get the details right. And so he did a lot of research into what was going on. There is an open question about exactly what happened behind closed doors on that night. Different people say different things. There are rumors. And so to a certain extent, he was working off maybe not the official history of what was going on, but the unofficial history that many people will attest to, but other people will contest. On the other hand, what I found interesting was kind of the mood of the film. And, there have been other films about the assassination of Park Chung-hee, both, done in recent times, but they had a different kind of tone. I mean, this tone, it was irreverent in one sense.
Yeah, that's true.
And it didn't look back upon the event with the kind of gravitas that you would expect, even from a director who is coming at it from a critical point of view.
Right.
And I think that was maybe what infuriated some people more than the actual content of the film.
Do you still see a high volume of criticism of Korea by Korean filmmakers in their movies?
Certainly there's a kind of dialogue that takes place in certain films with society. Filmmakers are presenting films that they know will produce conversation, and I think they're drawn to these sort of films. A good example from recent months is the movie The Attorney, which
all of my Korean friends loved.
Yeah, it's very well.
Most cried.
Yeah, I think that, and not just Koreans. This film, we screened it at the Udine Far East Film Festival in Italy, and among the 50, 60 films that were screened there, this was number 2 in audience scores, and so it works just as well, for audiences who aren't familiar with the backstory.
But it's also about a president.
Yeah, there's a huge backstory that isn't really even mentioned in the film. It was based on the early life of Roh Moo-hyun, who would go on to become president of Korea, who committed suicide not long after he finished his term in office. And who's looked back upon these days, especially by kind of young, progressive Koreans, with a great deal of nostalgia, because Korea has taken this rightward turn since then. The 2 presidents who have served since him have been completely on the opposite end of the political spectrum.
Yeah, my Korean friends seem to regard the first president that came after him as a jerk and the next one as dumb.
Yeah, I won't go on. I won't go on record kind of confirming or denying that, but
I'm just quoting.
But yeah, certainly, you either love or hate these 2 presidents. Most of the people I know hate them, and I fall into that camp as well. But But the film is interesting because it's a very idealistic film in a way. It's a story about someone who's discovering ideals and discovering the will to kind of stand up against people in defense of, the weak or the oppressed.
It seems like these political movies, a generational conflict really plays out over them, doesn't it? I mean, opinion seems pretty starkly generationally separated on not only movies but politicians here in Korea, right?
Yeah, definitely. There are great differences in terms of generations, not just politics, but culture and even language. Between young people and older people, the language they use is very different. There's also regional divisions between, especially the southwestern and southeastern regions of Korea. There's they're opposite ends of the political spectrum, and so there is a lot of conflict. Korean politics is always really interesting to follow.
Right. But as a foreigner, you can't allow yourself too much investment in it, right? Because even a Korean is kind of powerless. And a foreigner, even though you've been here a long time, it's sort of like, you meet guys in Japan like this who just get angry about Japanese politics, and it's like, look, there's a reason Japanese people don't care, because they can't do anything. You're not going to do anything at all, but their blood boils over everything,
Yeah, I've run into fewer foreigners, like long-term residents of Seoul, who carry that kind of anger, but certainly everybody's very opinionated about
yes.
And it's a source of conversation.
No doubt. Now, I've talked to Westerners here who say that being foreign gives them a sort of intellectual freedom. They can say things about Korea and issues in Korea that even Koreans can't say, or questions they feel like they can't ask, but the Koreans want to ask. So they're glad to have a foreigner asking those questions. Can you ask questions about cinema or Korea or the politics or anything that you feel like a Korean maybe couldn't?
To a certain extent I can. I think that, film critics in Korea, in one sense they're very independent-minded and they can be very critical. But, you are a part of a community, and I guess there's certain rules that you have to abide by as members of that community. And for me, I'm only kind of half a member of the community. And, sometimes I'm not even as intimately familiar with the rules as other people are. But people do cut me more slack as a foreigner.
That's one way of putting it, but what's an example of what you can ask about, what you can talk about that a Korean might feel less comfortable doing?
To a certain extent I was surprised by this. I wrote an article a few years ago about producers in Korea and the fact that kind of the dominant generation of producers who were so influential in shaping the film industry in the 90s and through the first half of the 2000s, they had lost a lot of their power in recent years. And I think that this has had a tremendous effect on the type of Korean films that are being made and the degree of, to a certain extent, the degree of creativity involved. Because I think that to make a good film, you need more than a good director. You need a good director working in partnership with a good producer.
Right.
And
everything else has to fall into place after that.
That's right. And to a certain extent, the producer has to protect the director from the money. And that's not happening as often these days. But I wrote an article about this, and I'm not... I think that a Korean could approach the same topic, but maybe would have to state it in a somewhat different way. But some of the responses to that article were basically along the lines of, we didn't feel quite free to speak out so directly about the situation. But
why didn't they?
Maybe because they knew the people involved personally.
I see. It is a small world, I suppose, within a country that's small. So there is always that risk. Foreigner or Korean, you're always going to be talking about somebody you've encountered, right?
Yeah, that's true. Although the longer I spend in Korea, the more people I get to know in the film industry, the more I get kind of pulled in that direction as well. And so it's becoming more difficult to review films when I know the director, for example.
Yes, there is that. Although, is conflict of interest even a thing in Korea? I feel like this is going to be the last country that starts talking about conflict of interest in any sphere.
It's an issue that people are conscious of, but maybe in a different way than in the West. There is kind of a basic difference of opinion on the subject of objectivity and subjectivity.
Right, yes.
And maybe this is kind of going off on too much of a tangent, but one thing I find really interesting is approaches to documentaries. And Korea was very influenced actually by Japanese tradition. And Ogawa Shinsuke, the Japanese documentary filmmaker who founded the Yamagata Documentary Film Festival. But his basic working premise was that to understand a community, you had to become a part of the community and to fight together with them and to experience the same things as they did. And only by doing that could you discover the truth of their experience. Whereas, Western documentaries make a great effort to be objective and to present both sides of the situation. And so,
with the assumption that there are exactly two sides, and here they are.
Right, and in reality, there are more than two sides, and it is very complicated. And of course, as the years go on, both Western and Asian documentaries become more complex in their perspectives. But the tradition that Korean documentary filmmakers follow is this idea of becoming a part of the community and presenting a more subjective voice.
With that assumption going in that this is what they're doing. So it's sort of if you know they're being subjective, they kind of come around again to being objective. If you yourself, the viewer, can understand what they're doing, because you have to. The objectivity is then on you, the onus to be objective.
Yeah, I think the key point is to be upfront about your position, your status, your own subjectivity. And that certainly is something that Korean documentary filmmakers recognize very much, and it's a big issue for them.
That's something that Koreans seem to be more okay with than at least the Westerners I know, that just state your biases and adhere to them fiercely if need be, but no one's really secret about their opinions. Is anybody pretending to be objective here in Korea? It seems like in no sphere are they doing that, but you know better than I would.
Yeah, it's certainly less common. I mean, certain types of, I don't know. I mean, the news claims to be objective.
Well, that's the news.
Yeah, of course, there are big issues with that. The news is a source of great controversy here.
But it's the same thing like in America. Everybody knows what is biased where. Everybody knows, and you can just figure it out from. You can figure out who believes what by knowing which news source they go to. Is it the same here?
It is to a great extent here. It's a source of great discussion. The general feeling, I think, is that it's among people who think about these things deeply is that it's better to be upfront and honest and overt in your prejudices, your position, in the way that your own experiences and your own perspective is affecting the way that you're presenting something.
Is that a sort of Korean way of thinking you've been won over to in your time here?
Yeah, I think that, I don't know, and I wouldn't call it, I guess, specifically Korean. I think that...
But did Korea win you over to it?
It did, yeah. Following Korean documentaries, you've seen that trend. An interesting thing is that if you watch Korean documentaries from the late 80s and the early 90s, there's a narrator who presents information, and often using first-person plural. We did this, we did this, we did that.
I see. They're always saying, "Uri this, uri that."
And so, this is narration that's written by the director, but the assumption is that we are united in our struggle.
Royal we.
Yeah, and that we experience these things together, and that this is our. And so it was activist filmmaking, and even back then they were very explicit about their loyalties, but as time has gone on, it's switched from we to I, and filmmakers are identifying themselves as individuals within this broader movement, and they're showing themselves on camera, they're recording their own narration, and trying to be as honest as possible about how their own experience is affecting the way that the documentary presents information.
Now, do you think you've become more of a, how to put it, Korean viewer over time? Things resonate with you now that wouldn't have resonated with you in film or what have you in the very beginning when you came here? Do you feel yourself more in line with what Korean people respond to in film?
It does seem that that's taking place. Maybe it's inevitable after 17 years. And
How do you know? What's a film or a type of technique that now works on you that wouldn't have, or that different techniques would have before?
I mean, occasionally there are certain films that will open, for example, at the Busan International Film Festival. And when it opens there, and you can kind of get a general sense of the critical opinion among the programmers and critics who are visiting Korea from other countries. And so, I mean, for example, there was a movie called The Russian Novel. It's by a Korean independent filmmaker. He's been shooting a number of different films over the years, but in Korea he's kind of gathering some real momentum. And even though that film really didn't leave a very strong impression on the programmers and the critics, I mean, it did get some invitations to festivals like Rotterdam and other places, but on the other hand, when it was released commercially in Korea, I think the response from the Korean audiences was quite warm, and which is not to say that a lot of people saw the film because it received a limited release, but
Of those who saw it.
yeah, I mean, just going through comments on Twitter, and you saw that people really did respond to it in quite a strong way. This is a film that I like very much as well. And
So it was you, and then people born in Korea who liked it.
yeah, not exclusively.
What about it? Were you on the same page as them about some quality of the movie that put others off?
Maybe it's even just something about the emotional texture of the film, where I've come to accept certain aspects of the way emotions are presented in Korean films as normal, not to be uncomfortable. And actually, maybe Russian Novel isn't a good example because it's not like a very melodramatic film or something like that. What you identify as normal and as special becomes different when you live in the country and you just kind of focus on a particular type of film.
Are there types of films that you don't respond to as much now?
Yes, and I'm certainly not always in line with the kind of the broad critical consensus in Korea either. And there's a recent movie called Hangongju, which has been winning just huge numbers of festival awards. It seems like every festival it goes to, it picks up at least one award. And it was well received in Korea as an independent film. That it sold more tickets than almost any other film of its type in the past. And yet I just have a real problem with this film. And there are other Koreans I talk to who have a similar reaction to it as me, but
this is a divide between Koreans then. Some Korean audiences love it, some don't. Or is it more loved outside of Korea?
It seems that in this particular case, outside of Korea, there seems to have been a broader acceptance of the film.
Korean in these conversations, Korean friends object to what about it?
It's a film that depicts a very traumatic event. Just this. You'd think it was really over the top, except that it is based on a true story. Obviously, the fact that it's based on a true story doesn't absolve the filmmaker of kind of the issue of how should we present this, and to what extent, in what way should we present this? And to me, it was I felt very uncomfortable with the way that the film kind of played with the viewer's sympathies and pulled it this way and that way, and then used.
No one wants to feel manipulated like a puppet, but some audiences are more receptive to that than others.
Yeah, and I mean, all films involve manipulation, but I think particularly in the way it uses abuse, the way it uses violence, and the way it kind of pushes you so much in one direction. I felt uncomfortable with the extent to which the film made me identify with the main character. It almost seemed kind of unhealthy the way that the film pushes you so much to identify with her, and then to the terrible things that happen to her at the end. It seems almost kind of sadistic.
Ah, yes. When you can feel the hand a little too heavily. I mean, we have the term heavy-handed for a reason, I suppose. I'm surprised that breaks down by nationality in some case with this film, because I can't imagine that viewers of another nation are more into being pushed to a certain reaction. But I guess it's possible. But I mean, that's a new film, and if you go back, look at older films from throughout the time you've been here in Korea, when you see these films, do you see in them the Seoul you know from earlier times, or the Korea you recognize from before? You've been here long enough that can you sort of be taken back to your earlier eras here by films?
Yeah, it's an interesting point, because there was this trend of nostalgia for 1980s films set in the 1980s, and obviously that was before my time, and so I felt no real personal connection with that. In recent years, the nostalgia has moved to a certain extent to the 90s, but I think it's still just a little bit too early for me. And so there's a movie called Architecture 101, which is set in the mid-90s and actually set very close to the neighborhood where I live. And yet I couldn't really identify with the film on a personal level. And so, to be honest, I haven't really found a film that brings me back to my earlier experience of being in
a film that's like, it's hard to say it's historical if it's the 90s, but a period film. But I mean more like older films. When you watch them again, can you recall that period? If it's a film from 1997, say, does that actually make you? Does it put you in some sense back in that older Korea and I guess a fairly different Seoul you once knew?
To a certain extent it does. I mean, that era, the time from when I came to Korea, was precisely the point at which Korean films were becoming a little bit less interested in realism and pushing more towards kind of visual experimentation and stylization of the reality that they were presenting.
As soon as you showed up, reality started breaking apart in cinema.
It did. Certain films, from the mid-90s, I've rewatched them over the years, and I guess my experience of watching them has changed, because in some ways I do feel kind of more remote from them as I did back at that time. A movie like Christmas in August, it was one of the first Korean films that I saw after coming to Korea. And it left a big impression on me. It was a story of a fairly ordinary character, and it presented his family life and his work life, and his experience of being in the community in a very ordinary way, despite the fact that there was this, he was facing this disease and everything else. And so, over the years I've rewatched that a number of times, and in a weird way I can't connect with it quite the same way that I did back then, because it does feel more remote, and that was, again, it wasn't ever a Korea that I directly experienced at that time, but
is it even the one you came into, in a sense, or is the fact of the film itself? Are you thinking back to the experience of you watching the film, or to the Korea that you arrived in?
Both. I remember watching the film for the first time, and then I watched it a number of times. That was one of the films that I used for my Korean study, actually, because it has a lot of good, simple dialogue to study. But yeah, it's funny. It made me realize how much Korean cinema has changed since then, and also in sometimes showing these films to students who are in their 20s, discovering that they really can't connect with these films.
They were born when these movies just came out.
Yeah, they don't respond to the films in the same way that the audience did back then.
Which tells you a lot about the change in Korea itself.
Yeah, the change in Korea, and also the change in the films, I guess. They feel somewhat dated now, to an extent that surprises me, because it doesn't feel like too long ago for me, but and yet when you go back and watch them, they do feel dated in different ways.
But finally, are there films you see these days, Korean films you see these days, that reflect in some sense to you, whether it's socially, visually, emotionally, aesthetically, reflect the Korea that your sons will grow up in, the sort of Korea ahead? Are there movies that make you think, that show you kind of what's down the road in terms of not just the country's cinema, but Korea itself, Seoul itself?
Yeah, a lot of Koreans are very kind of pessimistic when they look towards the future. They look at trends over the past several years that have led to a society that seems to be getting more and more competitive. In terms of the film industry, but also kind of the economy in general. Like, it's heading more and more. It's becoming more industrialized, more dominated by big companies. And so, most people look at trends and project into the future and see something somewhat less appealing than what they're experiencing now or in the recent past. And I have two boys, one in 4th grade, one in 1st grade. I'm concerned about the future and their future. And yet, I think in other ways there are reasons to be optimistic, because I think young people are growing up with a more international perspective. They're more open-minded about certain things. I think that probably this generation is going to surprise us in a lot of ways.
There'll be Koreans like the world has never known before.
Yeah, I think so.
Maybe fewer of them than the world's known before, but they'll be quite different.
Yeah, and I'm concerned because you see, especially among young Koreans, the degree of pressure that they have to deal with. And I don't envy them their position, but I do think that these younger generations may do extraordinary things in the future.
The pessimism our homeland settled into 45 years ago hasn't really kept the young people down, has it?
No, that's true. So.
Something to hope for. I've been sitting here in Garosu-gil, Seoul, Korea, with Darcy Paquet. He is a critic, a teacher. He is a film festival creator. He's sometimes an actor. He's many things, all related to Korean cinema. Darcy, thanks so much.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to all the backers of Notebook on Cities and Culture's Korea tour on Kickstarter. Adam Hartzell, Aidan Nullman, Alfred Lee, Andy Cooney, Angus Gordon, Bala Chinupati, Cam Smith, Chin Music Press, Dan Caraselli, Danny, Deborah Smith, Emmett Farragher, Humberto Grant, Ian Plosker, Ismail Kennedy, Jackie Gast, Jay Chang, Jeffrey Davis, James DeVito, Jonathan Filbert, Josh Paget, Kimberly Hahn, Manvir, Mark Hines, Matthew Workman, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Monica Eck, Michael Fransky, MJ Pritchett, Patrick O'Flaherty, Patrick Park, Piers Rippey, Robert Salzberg, Samuel Hansen, Sean Brown, Themistocles Crucis, Thomas Unterberger, Timothy Dobbs, and Wayne Wright.